Who does everyone have a packet today? You need one, Rich. Either you don't. You can get up and teach things. All right, everybody's okay. So we're just going to do kind of the same thing we did with the seller paperwork. So some of the stuff will probably go a little quicker this time than with the seller because some of it is the same. So as we go through it, so just as a reminder on this, what the idea of what we're going to do is just kind of going through talking about here's the paperwork at a minimum that you're going to need with a buyer. So anytime you have a buyer, you will need all of these forms that we're going to go through today, potentially some other ones, but as a general rule, these ones are going to be the ones on every transaction. So reminder, and I said I would talk a little bit more on this today, is so at the very top up there, you'll see that under the exclusive buyer broker agreement and agency disclosure, this is a legally binding agreement. Now, we talked about on the seller one about how it's pretty rare for somebody to list a property and then another agent. In fact, I don't even know if this is really even possible to have happen, but that somebody would list a property and then end up having another agent go in and list the property. But on the buyer side, it's not very uncommon for us to have somebody go and get a buyer to sign the buyer broker agreement, to have a buyer go sign a buyer broker agreement with an agent and then end up buying a house with somebody else. So keep in mind, like on the listing side, remember we pointed out it's a legally binding agreement. This one, we're now pointing out the same thing. This is a legally binding agreement. But yet, I'm telling you, it's not so uncommon for a buyer to go then use a different agent and buy a house. So why would that be? It's still a legally binding agreement. Okay, well, let's talk about it then. So here's what happens is, what ends up happening is, which by the way, this isn't too uncommon actually, even for on a listing side, of somebody to go list a home. And probably where the difference comes into play is if you were going to go out to list, you know, let's say a seller calls you up and they're frustrated. Hey, I want to sell my house. And will you come and sell my house? You drive up to help them sell the house and there's another agent's for sale sign in the front yard. Like you're probably going to then knock on the door and say, hey, is your home, do you already have a contract with somebody else? But if a buyer's frustrated and they called you and said, hey, come help me find a home, and you drove up to their house, how would you know that they're already working with an agent? Ask. Yeah, the only way you're going to know is through asking. Okay. So, and yeah, thanks, Matthew, because what Matthew said right there is right, if they're honest, because that's part of the problem is, and a couple of things actually that play into this is, it is not uncommon, especially in today's world, where an agent is working with a buyer. When I say working with, maybe they've gone and shown houses or they've talked to them on the phone, whatever it is. They then go to write an offer. The agent says, great, I'll put together the paperwork and send it over to you. They go jump into either .loop or a DocuSign, something like that. They fill out the paperwork, they send it over to the client. The client gets it. Do they take the time to stop and read it? No, instead, what do? Click, 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 clicks, everything signed. Okay, well, what ends up happening is the agent then had thrown in this buyer broker agreement into the paperwork. So the buyer signed it, but doesn't really know they signed it. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean that they can say, oh, well, I didn't know. Like they should read the contracts and be familiar with what they're saying. But it is not uncommon. So I am on right now I'm on the Grievance Committee at the Salt Lake Board, but have been on the Professional Standards Committee as well, which just kind of give you a brief overview, which I've got a whole separate class that will go into way more detail on this in the Code of Ethics. But if somebody files a complaint at the Board of Realtors, it first goes to the Grievance Committee. So if you were to file a complaint against another agent, that's going to go to the Grievance Committee. And I'm on the Grievance Committee right now. What happens then is we meet, basically, the Grievance Committee is a bunch of agents. So people, just you, me, all of us that are on this committee, they break it up into two separate groups. So we meet every other month, and then the other group meets the other month. And what happens is we meet then, and as agents or the public have filed a complaint against real estate agents, we're like going way down a rabbit trail for a second here, but I found agents usually think this is interesting to know. So we figure I'll take a minute on it. And then I'll tell you why I'm saying this too. But so what happens is they file a complaint. So I went, can't remember if it was last Wednesday or the Wednesday before, but anyway, within the last 2 weeks, I went over there. We had like 5 different cases that we were reviewing where agents or the public has filed a complaint against an agent. And we will then listen to one side of the story to hear what happens and what that agent said took place. We have to then determine, based on one side of the story, if that is true, assuming it is, assuming that what they said is true, is it a violation of our Code of Ethics? And if it is, then what happens is we will then forward it on for a hearing to be made. So if you've ever had a complaint filed against you and it got to the Grievance Committee and the Grievance Committee said, no, that doesn't look like it would be a violation, you'll never know. You would never know somebody filed a complaint if the Grievance Committee says they don't think it is. But if they say it is, then you'll be notified, okay? So now, the reason I say that, because then when a hearing takes place, what happens is, I was going to say 4 or 5, but it's really, there's 4 agents, and then the 5th is the committee chair. Meets, kind of listens to both sides of the case, meaning you would show up to present your side of the case, and I say case kind of loosely, but to present your side of the story. The other person that's defending themselves, or what we call the respondent, shows up to tell their side of the story, and then those 4 or 5 agents, and the reason I say 4 or 5 is if 3 out of the 4 feel one way, then the 5th person doesn't even vote. But if there's a tie, 2 and 2, the 5th person then votes, which is the committee chair. Well, so the reason I bring all that up is I have sat on many of those where there's a dispute between 2 agents. So the same thing would take place if you ever felt like I'm owed the commission, but another agent wrote the offer, but you feel like I'm owed the commission, you would go to a hearing where they would then decide who gets the commission. Well, many, many times in those, what will happen is an agent will show up and say, my buyer signed the buyer broker, therefore I'm entitled to the commission. Well, a lot of times the client then is there on behalf of the other agent and or written a letter, and what they will say is, I didn't even know I signed that because they just sent it over and I clicked through and signed everything. Now, like I said, that doesn't mean that, well, because you didn't read, you're not responsible. It's not what that means. But keep in mind that this buyer broker agreement is a piece of determining who's going to get paid in that scenario. It's only one part of how you're going to decide. Meaning a lot of times agents feel like, well, they signed it, therefore I should get paid. Well, that's part of the decision in terms of procuring costs. Now we'll come back to that. I'll come back to that story here in just a few minutes. But I just want to make sure you guys realize and recognize on the listing side, it's pretty rare that we have a dispute over who the listing agent was. Mm-hmm. But not uncommon that on the buyer side that we do have disputes. So I bring a lot of that up to make sure for you guys that you know, as you go through this with your buyers, make sure you take the time to explain it to them. And one of the things I recommend to do is if you are including it in a dot loop as you send it over to the client, make sure that you're typing in the message section, here's what's included, and detail it out. Like and maybe even saying something about this includes the buyer broker agreement that we talked about or something, so that if you ever do end up in one of these disputes for some reason, and the client's trying to say, well, I didn't know what I was signing, you could at least have because it just becomes his word against their word or whatever, because the agent will always say, oh, I told them what it was when I sent it over. The client's always going to say, well, we didn't know what we just thought we were signing an offer. We didn't know we were agreeing to anything else. Okay. All right. So just kind of keep that in mind as you go through this. All right. So the buyer broker agreement is between Century 21 Everest and blank the buyer. Now, so we talked about on Tuesday, filling out the real estate purchase contract. How do you know what to put for the buyer's name? So now just to test you to see if I did a good job of teaching you, how do you know what name, where should you get the name that's going to go there? Okay, ID.
What name they're going to use for the loan?
Yeah, good. Ideally, what we want is the name, which is probably going to match their ID, but we want to put however they've applied for the loan. And if it's a husband and a wife or two people that are applying for the loan, both names should be on there. If it was a married couple, but only one of them is going to be on the loan, only one needs to be on here as well. Now, with the buyer broker, it wouldn't hurt to have an additional person. Like, you're not going to run into issues with the underwriter on our buyer broker like you would on the purchase contract if you put an additional person who's not on the loan. But typically I just say put the same name and put it the way to match how they have applied for the loan. Okay. All right. Next, the terms of the agreement. So the buyer's retaining the company, including blank the buyer's agent. So clearly that's going to be your name that goes in there, right? As the authorized agent, and it will end at 5 p.m. on blank day of month of year. So I asked you on the seller side, so now we'll ask on the buyer one. How far out should we put that date in here? So for this date right here, how far out? It's not highlighted very well. You can see where I'm at. Anyway.
I usually put a minimum of 6 months.
Okay, 6 months.
Based on what you taught us in the previous class, minimum of 4, or you can do 6.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Ask the buyer how long they want to work.
Okay, good. That's how actually I like to do it. When I'm going to fill out this contract, how I like to do it is I like to just ask the buyer. So how soon are you wanting to be into a home? And by asking them how soon are you wanting to be in a home is going to give me an idea, one, of how long to fill this out for. But more important than that, what is it going to tell me? If I say, hey, when do you want to move in?
It's their motivation.
Yeah, ultimately what I'm figuring out is what's their motivation. Because if they said to you, I don't know, just sometime in the next year, they're telling you not a lot of motivation, versus if they said, oh, we have to be into something by, end of November. Well, now I know there's some motivation that's driving. So for me, I always ask. Now, there's not a right answer as to what to put there. So if you put 4 months, 6 months, whatever, typically for me, I just ask them, use this opportunity to ask, how soon do you need to be in? Once they tell me, then I'm probably usually going to put maybe a month longer than that. But again, it wouldn't hurt to put 6 months. There's nothing wrong with that. I just always use this as an opportunity of asking them how long they're wanting to or how soon they need to be into a home, if I don't already know, because now I know what their motivation is, and do I really want to spend a ton of time with them? All right.
Plus, I've had the office flag me for a buyer broker agreement expiring before we actually close, like after we go under contract and before we close.
Huh. They should.
Yeah.
Right, Emily?
What was it?
So he's saying that he had the buyer broker was going to expire before the actual closing was, but that shouldn't matter because
Yeah, it should be fine.
it shouldn't matter because of
Usually, I don't know. Usually
maybe we took it out of the contract. It used to say in here, I thought anyway, I thought it said the expiration date, maybe it is up here. Yeah, good. So, because this says, so let me just try to highlight it here. So it says ending at 5 p.m. on blank day of month of year, or the closing or the acquisition of the property, whichever occurs. Oh, it does say first. Never mind, this has changed then. it used to say. I'll have to watch as we go through, but so yeah, that might be it. Our contract used to say, our buyer broker used to say that if the property went under contract, it was whichever was later, the closing of the property. So, all right, so I guess, yeah, could be an issue. I was thinking that we had it worded the other way. Maybe it's on the listing agreement that says that.
Maybe it should be the other way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it probably should be, but I'll have to bring that up with Rob and see what he says.
What would it matter if it expired? Because technically you don't even need one of these to be the buyer, right?
Well, you do need agency, which this is the buyer broker and agency. Like in California, they have two separate forms of buyer broker and agency, so you wouldn't need that. But because ours is one and the same, yeah, you would need to extend it. So,
And it's our office policy.
yeah. Yep. All right. So next then is it's saying that you've got this A and B here. So it's saying for the acquisition of the property, whichever occurs first, to act as the exclusive buyer's agent in locating or negotiating for the acquisition of a property. And then you've got A or B here. So in blank county, Utah, or which I just realized there's an updated one of this, huh? And I don't have it. I just realized. Oh, well, I swear every time I teach this, I'm like, I go and update the form and then something else has changed. So anyway, we have it now to where basically it says in county or counties, I think is how it has it. So you could write, because a lot of times what agents will do is write in all county, Utah, which that doesn't really make sense. It
says county.
Oh, good. So I just don't have so the one, your printout that you have is correct. The one that I have on the screen just is wrong. So that's good. Okay, perfect. So yours is right. So just here's how you want to do this. So as you're working through with the client, a lot of agents will just put that all in there so that it has all counties in Utah. And that way you're covered with all of that. So because let me give you a quick story on that. So we had an agent that worked here in the office that came across a buyer who was frustrated. So remember, we just talked about this. They were frustrated with their agent and they felt like their agent wasn't doing a very good job for them. But in that scenario, they did tell our agent they had signed this buyer broker. They said, but the agent had put, and this was an agent with a different company, had put Salt Lake County on the buyer broker. And so the buyers were saying, we want away from this agent so bad that we're willing to not buy in Salt Lake County. We'll buy in either Davis or Utah County, and will you help us? And so our agent said, okay, I'll do that. So our agent signs a buyer broker with them for Davis County and Utah County that they're going to help them. And what ends up happening, though, is what you would guess. If the people wanted to be in Salt Lake County and they just really didn't like their agent, I mean, are you going to be willing to just not live in Salt Lake County because you don't like your agent? So what happens was they start looking in Davis County and Utah County, but then after a while, they're like, well, we don't really want to live there, but we still want you to be our agent. So can you help us? And what's the answer to that? Yeah, no, they really can't because of this agreement. So that's how I got involved. The agent came to me and said, so what do I do? How do I handle it? And what I recommended the agent to do is call the buyer's agent, or excuse me, the other agent that had signed this agreement with, and just say, try to work it out. Call them and say, hey, you know, the clients aren't happy, whatever. So what ended up happening is they ended up agreeing to pay this agent a referral fee. And so she let them out of this agreement in order to have that take place. So anyway, so just know you can put a specific county, you could put all counties. I mean, however you want to do that. The other option is the or be located at, and then you can put in an address. So here's the thing that I would recommend for you guys. And I love the fact that we have this option of either doing all counties or specific properties, because occasionally you are going to come across a buyer who just to begin with is unsure about signing one of these. They don't want to feel committed. Maybe they've had a bad experience with an agent, whatever it is. But for me, I have just found there is no, well, should be no reason, is probably the better way to say it. There should be no reason that they wouldn't sign this agreement even if you were just to say, okay, for the properties I'm going to show to you, would you be willing to sign it? Which, by the way, let's go back for a second to clarify something different from the listing agreement. I'm not opposed to even work when I'm working with a buyer. I'm actually even not opposed. I'm not opposed to up here on the term for how long this is going to last. Maybe you sign it for a week or 2 weeks. Like you could, a listing, we're not going to do that. We don't want to do a 1 week listing or a 2 week listing kind of a thing. But with a buyer, if they're hesitant to sign your buyer broker, maybe you do say, well, let's sign it just for a week. And then that will give you a week to see how it is working with me. Or maybe you do 2 weeks or a month or whatever. Just so recognize on this one, you got a lot more flexibility because, and the difference on that is with a listing, we're spending money on marketing that property versus on the buyer, we're not, the company's not spending money. You're spending time, which is equal to money. But so you just have to decide on that. But that's for me where I try to, when I'm working with a buyer, I want them to sign the buyer broker before I'm going to go show properties. And if they're hesitant to signing it for a 6 month or a 4 month or 3 or whatever on the buyer broker, then you might say, well, let's sign it for 1 month. And then at the end of the month, you're not committed to me if it's not working, either way. But let's say they're still hesitant to that. Then at a minimum, I'm going to say, well, will you at least sign this to be in effect for the certain properties that I'm going to show you? Now, if they say no to that, that should be a pretty big red flag that there's something going on. And in fact, I would try to find out what is the deal with that. So with that, let me give you another horror story real quick from being on professional standards. Is we had one that came in where the complaint that the agent had was this. And then I'll kind of tell you what my thinking was at the end of this. But what the agent's complaint was is that they had picked up this buyer. They were going out to show them properties. And at the end of showing them properties, they said to the buyer, hey, will you sign this buyer broker? The buyer said, no, we don't want to be committed to anybody. Okay. So he goes, finds more properties, goes out and shows them the next week properties. At the end of showing properties, says, will you sign this now? Buyer say no. He says, okay. So he goes and finds some more properties, goes out and shows them another time. And I don't know if this was weeks consecutive or how it worked, but over a certain amount of time, goes out and shows them properties. This time, the very last house that the agent's showing them, there's a model home. So there's some new houses right across the street. And they say, hey, could we go in and take a look at the model home? The agent says, sure. So they walk over into the model home, walk through it, and they say, okay, well, thanks. And the agent says, will you sign this buyer broker now? And they say, yeah, we still don't feel comfortable doing that. Okay. So a few days go by and the agent gets a phone call from the model home agent and says, hey, was the name of those people that you brought in a couple days ago, whatever? And the agent said, yeah. And he said, well, I just want to let you know, I just got an offer in on one of our properties from them, but it was written by a different agent. And the agent said, well, who was the agent? They told him who it was. So he hangs up, calls the agent, says, hey, did you write an offer on this, new construction with this particular buyers? And the agent says, no. And he goes, oh, well, I got a call from the model home agent, said you did. He said, no, I don't think so. Okay, hangs up, calls back to model home agent. He said he didn't write an offer. Well, it's right here in front of me. It's got his name on it. So the agent hangs up, calls the agent back again, says, I just got off the phone with the model home agent. They said the offer has your name on it. And he goes, oh yeah, it turns out my assistant was the one who wrote that offer. Okay. So here was the thing. The whole time, there was way more to this story than I'm giving you, but the whole time they were planning on, they were going to use this other agent to write the offer. They just were out looking because they liked this particular guy. He was a nice guy and he'll go show us the properties, but when we write it, we're going to write it with this other agent. So to me, my point with all of that is if they're not willing to sign this, especially if you were to say, look, we're going to sign it for a month and it's going to be only for the specific properties that I am showing to you, and they say no to that, there's probably something going on. So find out what's going on with that. All right.
I do have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Just for our own knowledge and just be aware.
Yeah.
What are possible scenarios where a buyer could get out of this besides the two termination of time or purchase of property? I mean, it's just say that, you know, the agent's not performing, when he's sick, it's on long vacation.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's a great question. So great question. So there's two parts to this. To what you're asking me, there's kind of two answers for. And what I mean by that is, it's not really two answers. There's one answer, but there's a second piece for what you're really asking. And I'm not sure that you understand that's what you're asking, but that's okay. As far as getting out of this contract, there really aren't ways out based on the contract. It's until you close on the property or the time runs out is the answer. The second piece, which is where I was saying that plays into what you're asking, is what's called procuring costs. So just because somebody has a buyer broker doesn't mean they are the procuring cause. And so the procuring cause is the person who's going to get paid for this. But with that being said, you still do have this agreement in force. And so what you're talking about is going to be in the event that an agent signed this with a buyer, but then they just, and I go and blank on the word of what?
Abandonment.
So no, it's not abandoned because, well, yes, it would be. Sorry, that is the word. But there's another word for if the client's the one who does it. So if the agent abandons them, then they could use that basically as the reason for moving on. Is if the agent quits calling them, which this stuff happens all the time. That's why we have all these issues. It is not uncommon for an agent to call up, or a buyer to call up and say to an agent, I signed one of these, but I haven't heard from them. I can't get a hold of them. And, you know, in that case, I would say, yeah, go for it. But I also would say, go for it, recognizing and making sure you explain to the client, they potentially could still owe a commission to that agent based on Section 2, which we haven't talked about yet. But it's pretty rare that happens, but it could happen. So, the other one, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Based on that, the person who showed those people all those homes, doesn't he have procuring costs to get paid? The other agent didn't do anything besides write the offer. So
yeah, in the scenario we were talking about that I gave before is, yeah, that agent had a pretty good leg to stand on to say, I went out and showed them the properties. But at the end of the day, what procuring cause is the way that I like the way the Arkansas Supreme Court defined it. And keep in mind, this, you know, the reason I bring that up is because it's Arkansas. But, and no offense, anybody from Arkansas? Okay, good. But the way the Arkansas Supreme Court defined it was, it's not the squirrel that gathered the nut, it's the squirrel that shook the branch that made the nut fall that entitled to the commission. That's how the Arkansas Supreme Court defined it. So basically but I actually like that definition because it's the squirrel that, you know, shook the branch that got the nut to fall that should get the nut, not the one who just happened to sneak in and grab it. So that's the definition. So on procuring cause, yes, that agent would have a pretty good leg to stand on to say, I went out and did. Look, the other way I like to think of it is think of it as dominoes that are falling over. It's kind of like who started the dominoes falling that led to the closing. So it's not necessarily meaning like you could have a break in that chain of those dominoes. If those dominoes start falling and then all of a sudden one of them doesn't, who shows up and then gets them falling again to have it take place? So here's the way I'll answer your question, Matthew, is this. If you're ever in one of those scenarios where you're going to go to the board over arguing over who's going to get paid a commission, do everything in your power to negotiate it to where you can come to an agreement without having to go there. Because having sat on many of those, we got some weird agents that end up on those things. Because sometimes I will go to those after reading everything and be like, yeah, we're clearly going to give the commission to this person. And then it ends up with the other person. And I might be the lone person saying, no, I don't think they're entitled to it. And so I don't know. Anyway, I've just seen many times where both agents walking in are 100% sure they're going to get the commission. And by the way, when you go, it's one or the other. The panel doesn't go, okay, well, you did a lot of work, Rich, so you get 50 or you get 25%. It's all or nothing. So do everything you can to come to an agreement without going there, because you might walk in there 100% convinced and leave without the commission. And you won't know when you leave, by the way. You find out later on. But anyway, so yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but yes, it definitely, that agent, here's the sad thing on that one, actually. When that one that I gave to you guys, that story happened, I was on the grievance. It was the first time I was on the grievance committee. And my argument was, the agent was told 3 times they wouldn't sign this. Like, you should have learned your lesson and moved on. But now I think my opinions changed now because of, at that point, I didn't really understand procuring costs the way I do now. And back then I was like, well, you asked them 3 times and they told you no, like, you're an idiot that you kept showing them. Too bad. You don't deserve the commission. Today, I would say, no, yeah, that agent went and did basically everything. And the other one, that agent shook the branch to get the nut to fall, and the other agent snuck in and took it. So I kind of feel bad on that one, because I was on the grievance committee and I convinced the whole rest of the committee to my way of thinking, which was too bad for him. And it never even went to a hearing. So if any of you were that agent, I'm sorry. All right.
Hey, Russ.
Yes.
Updated, to go back just a little bit, on the updated buyer broker agreement, it says this agreement shall automatically extend.
Oh, good.
Until the completion of any contracts entered into.
Perfect. So you are good. Okay, see?
Yeah.
I was right. Like, I swear it was in our contract. I just have the wrong one on the screen, so I apologize. We'll get that fixed. When I got here today, I was worried about that, but when I saw that it had the new logo, I'm like, oh, we got the right one.
But I've been using that one, so I need,
this one,
I need to change it.
Yeah,
if you use right, the packet is
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, just what I'm showing up here is the wrong one. So, all right, brokerage fee. So in the brokerage fee, yeah, see, and this one's changed too, to where it's got the blank line. So sorry. All right, brokerage fee. So this is saying that they will owe us 3% plus a $4.95 of the acquisition price. The packet you have has the blank lines, so you can write in whatever the amount is going to be and the additional fee. On that though, let me just kind of say, this piece for me, the important part of this is, especially with the blank line on there versus it hard printed in like this one is, you have to decide what your value is. And what I mean by that is, there are some agents who just will take whatever is being offered on the MLS. And so what I mean by that is, I have seen agents, especially it worries me with the blank line versus the pre-printed 3%. I have seen agents just put 0 on there. And in fact, I saw, if I go back to the start of my career, I have seen a lot of agents that would just cross it out and have nothing on there, because especially if you go back to when I started, and probably Judy, how old are you?
1999.
Okay, so yeah, you're a little newer than me, but
When did you start?
96.
Oh.
So but back then, did you ever see properties with less than 3%? Yeah, I mean, like, there was, and so because of that, back then, and I think this tradition's just carried over, like, it wasn't a big deal if you crossed out the 3% and just said, you're not going to pay me anything, because they aren't going to. It's going to come through the listing brokerage is how we're going to get paid. And so agents got in this habit of doing that. And I think to some extent it's kind of carried over a bit. But in today's world, like, you got to kind of decide what is your minimum value that you are worth, because I've seen on the MLS and hopefully this will be changing, but I've seen somebody they'll pay $1. And I won't, say what brokerage that was, but you've probably seen their billboards. But I've seen that they have put that they would pay $1 to whoever brings in the buyer. Well, if you had crossed out on here the 3% or on the blank line, put in 0, and you go show them that property, guess how much you're getting paid? $1. So you got to decide, what are you worth on that? And I would just recommend, so here's my recommendation to you. What you want to do when you go through this section with your buyer is you want to have a conversation with them that says, our brokerage charges 3% plus $2.95, or if you want to do $4.95, $5.95, $6.95, whatever you want to do. But our brokerage charges that. Not every home out there is going to be offering a 3% buyer agency commission. So in the event I come across a property that would meet your needs and they're offering less than 3%, we have a couple of different options. Is one, we could just not go see it at all. You can just decide you don't want to see it. Two is I can call the agent and try to negotiate with them if you authorize me to do that. Or number three is you could pay the difference. And so what I will do for you is when I see a property that meets your needs that is offering less than a 3%, I'll call and ask you what you want to do in that particular scenario. So you want to be having these conversations up front with your buyer about it if you want to be paid a full commission. Now, I know a lot of agents that are like, well, I'll just deal with it when it comes up. And I mean, I guess you can do that, but you're going to end up making less money. If you'll have a conversation with them up front and explain how it works, maybe the client says, yeah, if it ends up being a property we really like, we'll pay the difference. Then that's great. Okay. All right. Any questions on brokerage fee? All right. Next, then, protection period. So this one is similar to what we talked about with the on the seller side. Is this, but the difference on this one is saying that if within blank months after the expiration or termination of this agreement, the buyer or anyone acting on their behalf enters into an agreement to purchase, exchange, an option, lease option, whatever, a property that's located by the buyer or the buyer's agent or the company in which the buyer agent negotiates in the buyer's behalf during the initial term, the buyer agrees to pay us a fee. So basically, it's just any property that you go and show them and that you negotiate on their behalf for, and that could be just even, I would argue, just going and showing the property, I'm arguing on their behalf, but that they would owe us a commission.
Only on ones we've shown them or done it.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So it would only apply for anything that we've shown them. But again, on this, I would say don't put 0, because if you at least make them have to wait a month,
right?
So at least put 1 month in there, but I would put 2 or 3 months is probably what I would say. If you want to put 6, put 6 months, that's fine. Some agents say I'm going to put 12 months, that's fine too, but just whatever it is. The risk you run of saying I'm going to put in 12 months would be that same concept we talked about of abandoning them. Is the contract expires, you never talk to them again, and a year goes by and they go buy it, and 11 months go by and you try to go, hey, I'm going to be able to commission. I think you'd have a hard time getting it. All right. Buyer representation and disclosure. So this section, here's how I explain it to them when I get to this, is I'm telling the buyers, basically what this is saying is that you are warranting to us, and this is crucial, this part, because when you went to the board, they trained you that you need to ask if they've signed a buyer broker agreement. Well, actually what the buyer brokers say, which you do need to ask, by the way, in fact, let me clarify that. But the way they train it to you at the board is not actually what our code of ethics says. The way they train you at the board is that as soon as you meet somebody, you need to ask them if they have signed this. But our code of ethics actually says you have to ask before providing a substantive service. And then it puts in parentheses, writing an offer or presenting a CMA. So until you're doing something like that, writing an offer or presenting a CMA, you actually don't have to ask if they're working with another agent. Even though they train you, you need to ask as soon as you meet them. The reason they do that is to try to stop all the arguments that go on. But our code of ethics says you have to ask before providing a substantive service. Well, let's look and see what this actually says. This says the buyer warrants that the buyer has not entered into any other exclusive buyer broker agreement with any other brokerage that is still in force and effect. The buyer will, in all communications with other real estate agents, notify the agents in advance that the buyer's entered into this exclusive buyer broker agreement with the company. So when I get to this section, when I'm working with the buyer, I tell them, part of your responsibility, what this section says, is that you will tell any other agent that you come in contact with, you've signed this with me. Now, that's going to be helpful because if somebody shows up saying to you, hey, I've already signed a buyer broker, that's going to, you do at that point need to back off and not try to move forward. Okay. So I always train my clients, if you walk into a model home, you come in contact with an agent, you call about a property, go online. If they call you, just tell them I've already signed a buyer broker. And I just tell them from the standpoint, it's going to have them leave you alone. And if they don't, then call me and I'll call them and tell them to back off. The other things this says is that they'll furnish us with any relevant personal or financial information. They'll exercise care and diligence in evaluating a property, and that they will hold us harmless and against any injuries that take place when you're out looking at a property. And upon signing this agreement, they will also sign our due diligence checklist form, disclose to us any properties that they have already been in the process of acquiring or had interest in, all of that kind of stuff. So that's what that section is saying. Okay. So you'll notice I went in a little more detail on that than most of them we do. And I think it's just because those things are important for you to have a conversation with your buyer about. Okay? All right, agency relationships. This is similar to what I already told you on the seller side. I just am telling them, look, I'm on your side. I'm negotiating on your behalf. We're not adversaries. We're on the same team. Heading forward, anything I know, you will know. The only exception to that would be section 5.2 down here, which is if I was going to be a limited agent. And then I just tell them what that would mean is just if I end up listing the property that you're interested in, then I would have to be limited. And what that means is I couldn't tell you the least amount that the seller would accept for on an offer, but I also couldn't tell the seller the most you would be willing to pay, which if there was another agent involved, I couldn't tell you that because I won't know it anyway. So it's really no different. That makes sense. Good. The one thing I do want to point out though is, let me see if I can find it really quick here, is I think it's this, yeah, right here. A limited agent has fiduciary duties to both the buyer and the seller as required by law. However, some of those duties are limited because the agent cannot provide to both parties undivided loyalty, confidentiality, and disclosure. So in the event you're a limited agent, what becomes limited? Undivided loyalty, confidentiality, and the disclosure. Okay. All right. I've satisfied my division requirements for that. All right. Professional advice.
Does that go for broker? So is that just the agent or is it the brokerage?
Yeah, great question. So if in the event that you took them to a property that was listed by Everest, a Century 21 Everest agent, then the company would have the undivided loyalty, confidentiality, and disclosure, but as the agent, you still have your full. Yeah, so great. So if it's your listing, then you would have the undivided loyalty, confidentiality, and disclosure would be limited, but if it's the company, only the company. So raw has to be neutral.
Gotcha.
Yep. Great question. All right, professional advice. So on this one, and I think I told you this already, but when I get to this section with a buyer, I always say, this section says to you, don't believe anything I tell you. No, that's not true. It says, don't trust anything I tell you. That's what it says. That's usually how I explain it to the client. And then they give you this shocked look on their face. And then I just tell them, look, I am not a property inspector. I'm not a CPA. I'm not an attorney. If you have those type of questions, you should contact them. And then for me, when we get to this section, I'll usually pull out the due diligence. We're not going to right now because we'll cover that in just a minute. But I always just tell them, don't rely on me for survey boundaries, all that kind of stuff. Because inevitably, when you go out and show a property, they're going to ask you a question. So where's the property line on this? Or something like, about the physical condition of the property. And then I always just say, remember I said, don't believe anything that I tell you when it comes to that kind of stuff. It looks to me like here's where the boundary line is, but I'm not a surveyor. So if you really have those questions, you want to check with somebody who is a professional. Okay. All right. Dispute resolution says that in the event that a dispute arises, that we shall go to mediation before going to court. And then section 8 down there says that in the event that we do end up in court, the prevailing party is entitled to reasonable attorney's fees. Yep. Section 9 gives us the buyer authorizations. This is similar to the seller. On the seller packet, it had a way longer list, but this one, the buyer's authorizing us to disclose after closing to each MLS in which the company participates the final terms and sales price of the property. Why do we need that?
Comps.
You guys are like, I don't know, I wasn't even listening to what you said. What?
Comps.
Okay, we need it for comps, but that's not why we need their permission. You're right on. We do need it for comps. And it would be horrible if people didn't.
Why
give us
do we need their
permission.
permission?
Yeah, why do
to
we need their permission?
post it?
Yeah,
Personal information, I think it's used as non-disclosures.
there we go. Because, which is tied to what you said, it's because we are a non-disclosure state. So without their permission, we couldn't even put that on the MLS. And could you imagine trying to do CMAs without it? Good luck. All right. This one also gives us the authorization to communicate with them for the purpose of soliciting real estate goods. So it gets us past the do not call list.
Do they have the option to ask not to have it disclosed?
Yes. There is a separate form that we have to fill out. And so, yeah, if you for some reason came across a scenario, and there are times when it would make sense not to do it. Early on in 2008 or 2009, there were people who were like, I got to get out of this property and I will take anything. Just give me an offer and I'll take it. In that scenario, it made sense to sometimes be like, okay, there's, if somebody was selling a house for 50% of what it's really worth, it might make sense to say, let's not disclose that on the MLS. But there needs to be a pretty good reason if you're not going to, because it just hurts.
I just had a flashback from that. That's why.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you remember. All right, section 10. There either are or are not additional terms. So again, on this, if there are not, just check the are not box. If there are additional terms, check the box that there are additional terms, and then you grab an addendum and put them on there. And an example of that would be, let's say that you did have a buyer who had signed a buyer broker, but it was only specific to a certain property. Then you might do there are additional terms and go to an addendum and say, this particular property address is excluded from this contract or something. Okay. So pretty rare that you end up doing that. I don't know, Evelyn, how often do you see addendums to the buyer broker?
At the initial stage, not really.
Yeah.
The only thing that we do see like addendums for is if they're adding somebody or if they're removing or leaving.
Yeah, okay, yeah, because if you're gonna change the buyer broker, you're gonna end up taking 2.5%, but you put 3 on there, then you would need to go do an addendum to it. Or yeah, if you're gonna add another buyer to the contract. Good, all right. Section 11 is the equal housing opportunity. That basically just says that we'll follow all the federal, state, and local fair housing laws. So you gotta make sure you're doing that. Which, so like, and I think we talked about this, but if for some reason you had a client who said, I don't want to buy a house in this area or that area or whatever, like your answer needs to be pretty generic of, hey, there's great areas everywhere. There's good and bad that takes place in every city. We should at least take a look there. Then it's up to them. But you want to make sure you're not saying, oh, you don't want to buy a house in that area because of whatever.
I got tested at least 3 times in Michigan.
You had 3 times?
At least.
I think I've had 1 time, but I can't even verify that I really did. So yeah, you will potentially run across scenarios where a tester may call you up and ask you questions trying to trap you to see if you're violating the fair housing laws. So all right, section 12, electronic transmissions and counterparts. So this one, we're agreeing
that we can do things electronically, so either via email or a fax. And it's as good as the original, which the counterparts section doesn't mean as much today as it did when we would do faxes. Back when we were doing faxes of these things, it was not uncommon that you would fax one to the husband, one to the wife. They would then each sign it and send it back to you. So you actually had their signature on two different pieces of paper. That's what counterparts are, is saying that it's okay that you have their signatures on two different pieces of paper, as long as it was the same document. But pretty rare that we run into that anymore. All right, due on sale clause. This one, I always just, when I'm going through this with a buyer, is I'm just going to ask them how they feel about if they were to do a seller finance or a lease option. And in the event that they were interested in those, then I would want to take the time to explain a due on sale clause. So what's a due on sale clause?
In a mortgage, when it is sold of any sort, then whatever's due is due on that sale.
Yeah, good. So they can't continue to make payments. You need to pay off the loan, basically. So there are certain types of transactions, which is going to be lease option and seller finance, that if the lender knew about it, might be like, hey, you can't do that. We're going to call the note due and payable. Which, if for a buyer, that could become an issue if that happened, because they could potentially lose the house. So you want to make sure they understand how all of that works if they were going to enter into one of those transactions. Yep. Which I keep wondering, actually, as interest rates, like we're at what, almost 7% now on interest rates. I keep wondering if we're going to start seeing something. We're going to start, let me rephrase that. We are going to start seeing some creative financing showing up, of because people have loans that are at 3% or maybe even a little less than 3%. And agents are pretty creative sometimes. So we're going to start seeing scenarios where people are going to be like, hey, you could just take over, do a seller finance on this part. You only have to go get a mortgage for X amount at this higher rate, blah, blah, blah. So we'll start to see it. You watch. All right. Section 14 is, this is the entire agreement. There's not anything that, if it's not in the agreement, it's not agreed to. Okay. So that's what that's saying. Effective date says that the exclusive buyer broker agreement is entered into and effective as of the date the buyer and the authorized buyer agent have signed the agreement, and the authorized agent or the broker has received a signed copy of it. So those two things is when it becomes effective. So that, the reason I point that out is, remember on the REPC, it's our effective date was the offer reference date up at the top. This is saying it's actually when it's signed.
We don't have that on this form.
Oh, really? So Rob's taking that out. All right, never mind. What does yours say? Nothing?
No, 14 is it.
Oh, you don't even have section 15, so forget that. All right. So buyer's going to sign here. You're going to sign as the authorized agent. And before you flip the page, do you have a real estate need or a property to sell or purchase outside of our market area or the state of Utah? Don't forget to ask them that so you can get outgoing referral. All right, now flip the page. Okay, so buyer's due diligence checklist. So on this form, what we're going to do is we're going to have them sign this. And again, remember we talked about the seller disclosure, and I said that's the seller's get out of jail free card, basically, is in the event they end up in court, the seller is going to rely on that. That seller disclosure is going to come back to either get them out of, I'd say get out of jail, but losing their lawsuit or winning. Most likely is going to come down to what it says on that seller disclosure. The buyer due diligence checklist is your get out of jail free card. Okay. So when you are working with the buyer, we want to make sure that we're filling this out. So you're going to put in your name as the agent, their name as the buyer, go through and explain to them. And I always start it with this piece right here, that we're trained in the marketing of real estate. Neither the company nor its agents are trained to provide professional advice. And then I just always tell them each of these bolded items on here. So building zoning code, rental of property, hazardous waste. I just tell them all of these things are some ideas that you might want to consider doing additional research on. If you're worried about it and concerned about it, you should do testing for it during your due diligence. So The reason we do that is if they ever try to come back and say, my agent wouldn't let me, which will be interesting to see that too, because over the last 2 years, we had people throwing out offers of, I don't care, I'll take the house, I'm not going to do an inspection. Like potentially we could see where there may be some lawsuits coming back later on, buyers trying to say, well, my agent told me not to do any of that stuff. And this is going to be your no, we told you right here, you should do that stuff. Okay. So that's kind of your get out of jail free. So
In fact, if they don't want to have them initial that spot.
yeah, if they don't want to, you would want them to initial that they're choosing not to. All right. You're going to sign, or they're going to sign this. Then we have an extra layer of protection. So every agent out there should be using a buyer due diligence. But at Everest, we've created an additional form that is a receipt and acknowledgement of it. Now, remember we talked about that how buyers are always going to say, like guaranteed, if a buyer ends up in court, they're, even if you've had them sign that due diligence, you know they're going to try to say, well, I didn't know what I was signing, right? And if you stop and look at that form, I mean, legit, it is 3 pages long and there's a lot of information on there. They're probably not going to stop and read through all that. So because of that, we put this extra layer of a receipt and acknowledgement of it. Now, here's what I like about this form for us is we're going to have them initial next to home inspection. So again, now picture that if the client tries to come back later on and say, I didn't know, or they didn't tell me I could, we're going to say, here's the buyer due diligence form that you signed. There's one. Number 2 is here's you initialed right next to home inspection. And the thing I like about this is if you go back here on our due diligence form and you go back to the, where's it at? Physical condition here that goes through and has all this information. Like very few people are going to stop and read all that. But if you go to ours,
It's different. The new one is really different. And it doesn't even have homes.
oh man, I gotta
I mean,
update
this is
this.
super different.
Yeah.
Oh, you're gonna hug me.
Give me a hug, Judy. Come
You're
on.
welcome.
All right, never mind. It's not on. Sorry.
No,
Yeah,
you're-
give me a hug. All right, so here's the idea though, is the thing that I like about it is notice that everything after where they're initialing is just like one sentence. Like it's going to be harder to say, well, look at all that information. I didn't read it. So yeah, I apologize.
But shouldn't home inspection and
Yeah, it should. I'll have to ask Rob. Do you know Evelyn White's? Do you have any idea why? I'll have to ask Rob White because I agree with you. I think home inspection should be on there. I'll have to ask him why we took it off. Anyway, that receipt and acknowledgement just is going to be another layer. If you ended up in court and we can say, not only did they sign this, which by the way, before I say it, I guess let me make sure what I'm going to say is true. Yeah, it's not true, so I'm not going to say it. It's changed. What I was going to say, so on the old one, it had a spot for property address, and the new one doesn't have that, right? Or did I miss it?
I don't see it.
The thing that I liked,
doesn't.
that was I'm gonna have to talk to Rob on some of this, because the thing I liked about it is that you could have them sign the due diligence just when you first meet them. But then let's say you had written 3 offers on properties, I would do, my recommendation was always do this on all 3 of the properties. Because again, if they tried to sue, you could go, 3 times they filled this out. So I'll have to ask Rob, but anyway, all right, confirmation of earnest money receipt. So the next page. The next page is the confirmation of earnest money receipt. You're going to use this once we get the earnest money. Okay, so this is your proof that you received earnest money. So you'll put the buyer's name in there. Let me see, somebody's typing something. Oh, did I put the wrong one on there? Does it say land?
Oh, it does for land.
Oh, I put the wrong. So even when I did update it, I put the wrong form. All right, I'll fix all that.
Good catch.
Thank you. Let me make a note here. Perfect. Thanks, Shannon. Good catch. That makes more sense why I wouldn't have that. Okay. All right, so on confirmation of earnest money received, we're gonna have the buyer put in their name here. You're gonna put your name as the buyer's agent, Century 21 buyer brokerage, the seller, seller's agent, seller's brokerage, the property, the city, the county, all of that. Then you're gonna be putting in here the confirmation of earnest money, the date you received it, or excuse me, the offer reference date of the property, which remember that from off the MLS, or not the MLS, the REPSI, and the date that you received it, and then how you received the earnest money, and then you're gonna print your name and sign that you received it. Okay, and then you'll want to send that to the other brokerage. That here's our, because you have only so many days, right, to get it, 4 days to receive it, 4 days to deposit it. So we need to get this sent over showing we received it within the 4 days that we were supposed to. All right. I feel like I'm going really fast. Am I going? Slow me down if I need to. All right, limited agency consent. When do we use this?
When we are selling our own listing.
Okay, good. So one is if you're selling your own listing, when's the other?
If I'm selling the listing, you were represented
Yeah,
buyer.
good.
Someone in that same brokerage.
Perfect. So here's how I say to think of it. If both the buyer's agent and the seller's agent, so you could be that same person, but if both the buyer's agent and the seller's agent are in the same brokerage, so both with Century 21 Everest, you need this form. What about though, there's a Century 21 Harmon down in Provo. What if they were the listing agent, you had the buyer? Do we need this?
No.
Correct, we do not need it, okay? All right, so you're gonna fill this out though, put the name of the buyer, name of the seller, the agent representing the buyer, the agent representing the seller, the name of the brokerage, so Century 21 Everest, the address of the property. And then this goes through and just details out some of what we had already talked about, what a seller's agent is, a buyer's agent, what a limited agent is, which we already talked about, the limited agent, which actually, let me point out one thing here though. Let me see if I can find it real fast. I don't know if I can remember where it's at. Oh, here it is, I think. Yes, here it is. This conflicts within the, so one of the things that I want to point out is on that number 7, conflicts with the in-house sale. Says there are conflicts associated with an in-house sale. For example, agents affiliated with the same brokerage discuss with each other the needs of their respective buyers and sellers. Such discussions could, and probably you could, instead of saying could, you could probably change that to say such discussions shall inadvertently, because they will happen, inadvertently compromise the confidentiality of information provided to those agents. For that reason, the company has policies designated to protect the confidentiality of discussion between agents. So here's the point. It is not uncommon in a meeting like this for somebody to be like, oh, hey, just so you guys know, like I got this seller, they have to get their home sold by the end of the month or they're going to lose it. Like you shouldn't do that unless what?
You have permission.
Unless you have your client's permission, but it happens all the time. So that's what this is always pointing out, is to point out to the clients that you guys talk too much. No, I don't. Especially Rick. All right, section 9, authorizations. So on this one is where you're either going to check box A or B. So either there's one agent, in which case you'll put your name in there, or there's 2 agents, in which case you'll put your name as either the seller or the buyer's agent, whichever one you are. And then whoever within our brokerage is the other side of the transaction. And then on this, the buyer's going to sign, the seller's going to sign, and then one of you will sign here. So in the event there are 2 agents, only one of the 2 of you has to sign because you're just signing on behalf of the group. Oh, are you?
We're just doing Rob or Jason.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they request Rob.
Oh.
So every time there's an agency, either Rob or Jason.
Okay, good to know.
Even, I think even your office.
I am authorized to, but Rick's not, right?
No, they never.
Yes.
I
love
give too much away.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for bringing that. So either Rob, Jason, and if they're not available, then me.
Yeah.
Maybe that's how it is. Either Rob or Jason. So don't come to me unless you've tried Rob or Jason.
They just want to feel important.
Well, hey, it made me feel important that you can't sign it.
He's not on that
He's not even listening to me.
True.
See?
What?
Exactly. Okay. So yeah, usually what I say on that, so thanks for clarifying that, Evelyn, is usually I say on these, anytime there's a spot to be signed, if it says principal broker, it's got to be Rob or Jason that does it. But apparently, with the exception of this one. So, yeah. Okay, good to know. I learned something today in class. All right, next, wire fraud alert. So now, with your buyers, make sure you do this. So Matthew, make sure you're paying attention on your house for this.
I'm a anal on this.
Okay,
It
good.
scares me, right?
Yeah.
To send off that amount of money and not know where it goes.
Yeah. So with your buyers, with the seller, remember I brought it up and I'm like, yeah, you're pretty rare. Your seller's going to end up doing a wire anyway. So it probably doesn't matter. With your buyer though, there's a pretty good chance they're going to end up wiring funds. So make sure you take time to explain this to your client, that there is a lot of fraud that goes on in terms of wires. And we actually had an agent. I don't know if I told you guys this already. If I did, sorry, you're hearing it again. But we had an agent that used to be an agent at our company. She's left now. She's no longer with us. But not long after she left Everest, went to another company, she found a home that she was going to buy and fix up and sell. So she was going to flip it. And it happened to be listed by one of our agents. And so she put in an offer, got the offer accepted, was going to be wiring the money to the title company, got an email saying the wire instructions had changed. She then wired to that wire number. Luckily, somehow the title company figured out, and I don't know, I don't remember the details of how this came about, but somehow within like an hour, less than an hour, they had found out that she had done that, and they were able to call the bank. And having worked at a bank, I kind of know how it works. So they luckily had not, it goes into the bank then has to send it off to whatever bank it's going to. Luckily, that had not happened yet, and so they were able to call it back. But once that wire's gone, that money's gone. So make sure you're talking with your clients of like double, triple check. Like I'm with Matthew. Like it scares me of like, I'm almost like, go to the title company and be standing there with them to make sure that it's.
I have them on the phone. I was like, you'll send it while we're talking.
Yeah.
And then if it doesn't come through in the next 10 seconds, it's not happening. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
To that degree.
Yeah. And so be that way with your clients, because here's the thing. Number one, you don't want them to lose their money. That'd be tragic. But even more tragic, well, not really, but to you more tragic, you're not going to get paid because they won't be able to buy the house.
Their money's gone.
Yeah, their money's gone. They can't close and you won't get paid. So really theirs is more important than yours, right?
Yeah.
I'm kidding. But you still want to get paid. All right. So go through this with them. Tell them never trust wiring instructions sent by email. Like call and check. Don't if you get notice, which it won't happen. So just know it's not going to change. But double, triple, quadruple check before you send a wire that it is going to the right place. Okay? And these guys have become pretty sophisticated. Even of they'll put a phone number on the email, and then the person calls the email, the number from the email, and say, "Hey, I'm just calling to confirm that this is the that's the right one," and it's not. So, like, don't trust emails. Okay? For that. All right, have them sign it, and then you're good. Next, affiliated business arrangement. So this one, what you're going to do is explain to the client. So you're going to put in their name at the top, put in the property address, the date. And you're explaining to the client, which we talked about this already on the seller side, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but that they are not required to use the listed providers, and that there are frequently other settlement service providers available that do the same things. But because we have Inspiro and North Star are sister companies of ours,
we have to disclose that they are a sister company and these are the fees ranges that they charge, okay? And then you'll have your client sign. Sometimes agents will say, well, my client's not going to use either of these, so do I still need to? Yes. And the reason being that you still need to is because it's possible down the road that that changes and that they end up switching over to Inspira or to North Star. So we need it in the file, okay? Even if they're not using it. All right, lead-based paint disclosure. When do we need it?
1978, right? Before.
So if the home was built in 78, do I need it?
No.
Good. But if it's before 78, we need it. So you'll put in, now on this one on the buy side, you should be downloading it right off of the MLS. So you're not going to be filling out the form. It should be already mostly filled out. You'll download it from the MLS. It'll already have the address of the property. It should already have the seller's initials as to if they know if there's lead-based paint or if they have knowledge of lead-based paint, if they have reports or they have no reports. Then down here, the buyer's going to acknowledge first that they've received the information in 2A and B, that they've received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in the Home. So make sure that you are sharing with your client through .loop that pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in the Home, because they're going to initial that you've given it to them, that they've read the lead warning in section 1 above, and that they're either going to take a 10-day opportunity to test for lead-based paint, or they're going to wait. What do we have to have if they're going to take the opportunity to test for lead-based paint? In addition to the disclosure, we need the addendum. So remember, it's the disclosure that's required on every property built prior to 78. If they're going to test for lead-based paint, we also need the addendum.
So is this form needed for any house after 78?
No.
Okay, only an older.
Yep, if it was built prior to 78.
Yep. Like recycle.
Yeah, otherwise you wouldn't need it. Wouldn't hurt to have it. And I think I mentioned before, like if you ever do a bank foreclosure, if you're either the listing agent or the buyer's agent, they're going to do one of these, even if the house was built. Well, even if it's not built, they would do it, but yeah.
No paint at all.
Yeah, there's no paint at all, but they're still going to do it. So if your client initials this one, just remember you need the lead-based paint addendum as well, okay? If they initial down here, you don't. The listing agent should initial this one that they've explained it to the seller, and then everybody gets to sign here. Buyers, sellers, and both agents.
This form is different too, I believe.
Is it?
This page, yeah.
Oh, that's right. They did a pass. I'm sorry.
Just so you.
Yeah, I just need to update with what I've got in here. All right, last page. We're almost done. Next is the client and property, or sorry, this is the commission report. Now, here's the main thing to know on this. The commission.
My name everywhere on this, everyone you do, be payable to Rick Bentley. No?
No. So, put my name.
Oh.
Instead of Rick. So, this commission report has to be, you have to fill it out in an Excel spreadsheet. You can't upload an Excel spreadsheet into .loop. So when you fill it out, then you need to save it as a PDF and then upload the PDF to.
Oh my God, really? Lost me. How else can I get paid?
The best way to get paid, tell her how she should do this then. No, yes, you made a transaction.
Yeah.
Oh, I was giving you a chance to sell and you didn't do it.
It's totally.
My recommendation, I know, I totally set you up, like, alley-oop, and if you passed it to me, okay, so how do they do it, Rick?
They hire a TC. It's what I do on every transaction I do. So I don't have to do this stuff.
Yeah, if you're using a transaction coordinator, you don't have to fill it out.
And it's always.
I was like, I've never done this.
It's what?
That's why.
So you do it.
That's why you let the TCs. So if you're gonna let the TCs do it, you don't need to listen to anything else I say.
And upload it to.
No, hey,
The only thing we need to learn this because the theses are going to be available from 9 to 5, and after that you have to.
Okay, good. Yes, if you want to get paid.
Yes.
All right, so let's run through it. So the way you're going to fill this out is you're going to put in the address of the property, who the buyer is, the seller, the title company, and then you'll notice on this is a drop down, which I'm on a PDF, so it won't let me do it. But if you click on that, it'll open up to where you can select commercial if it was a commercial, or a lease if it's a lease. Okay. You're going to put in here the closing sales price. So what the purchase price was, and was the commission based on gross, net, or a flat amount. So again, this is a drop down you could click on. The default on here is gross, but if on the NLS it says you're being paid on the net, then you would switch it. So do I need to explain what the difference between gross and net, or does everybody know? Does anybody not dare to say they don't?
It would be nice to know.
Okay, then I'll tell you. There you go. Thank you. So, and it hasn't been that big of a deal the past couple of years because there hasn't been seller paid closing costs. But if somebody selects net, if on the MLS it says you're going to get paid on the net commission, you're going to take whatever your offer amount is. And if you've asked the seller to pay closing costs, the commission will be calculated based on the purchase price minus what the closing costs were. So let's say it was a $300,000 purchase price. You asked for $5,000 in closing costs. Your commission would be based on $295, not $300. So try to do gross. All right. Flat amount, obviously you would just put in the flat amount. Here's where you're going to put in the commission that was being offered on the MLS, or if your buyer is paying the difference. Commission to an outside referral company. If you're paying a referral to somebody outside of Everest, you're going to click on this box and change it to yes, and then a new box over here would open to where you would put who that referral fee is going to. Commission advance company used. If you did, then you would do yes. Don't ever use that. That's like payday loans, so you don't want to do that. Down here, you're going to put in the admin fee collected. So how much of the fee was collected? So if you got $495, $595, $695, you would put that in there. If you didn't, if you got nothing, put 0. How much of the earnest money is being held by us? Put in there. And any agent credits given at title. So did you offer at title to pay something? You would put it in here. This should be then, it'll calculate what the check that's going to come from the title company to us should be right there. So when that comes in, this office is going to check to make sure what your commission report said matches this. Then down here, you're going to give the breakdown of how to break out that commission. So is it a single agent? If it's just you, you would leave this. If you're on a team, you would click on this and select team, and then it'll open up a box over here for the team as well. You're going to put your name in here. And if it was a team one, it would have what percentage is going over to the team, and you would put that in there. So you're going to put your name in there. It's going to deduct out the admin fee. So up here, if you didn't collect it, so if this had been 0, this would have just been 9,000. You end up paying the $295 if you don't collect at least $295. Okay. That gives you what the agent's base is, and then what your split is, you're going to put in here. So if you are on a 70-30 split, you're putting in how much the company is getting. So notice here, it's saying the Everest Group Realty. If you are on a 70-30, you put the 30 in here. If you're on an 80-20, you'd put the 20. Okay. The admin fee, or not the admin, the franchise fee, which is going to be 6%, that goes back to Century 21, gets calculated and deducted from here. If you paid the admin fee, so like I said, if you had not put $295 here, then it's going to calculate it right here to deduct it from you. Do you want to contribute to the foundation? The suggested amount is $21. You can change that to more or less, whatever you want to do, to donate to our foundation. And then the transaction coordinator fee, here's what I would say. If you're filling this out, then probably you're just going to leave it as 0. If they're filling it out, they'll know what to put in there and they'll fill it out for you. And Evelyn will put her name in there as the transaction coordinator. That's how she's getting it. And then this is going to be how much your check will be. And do you want it direct deposited, yes or no? So if it's a no and you want it to yes, switch it to yes. And that way they'll just wire or no, I guess it's not a wire, but electronic transfer the money to. Questions? All right, we got done a little early today. Anybody gonna complain? Good job. Okay, so yay! Now, so especially for you guys on Zoom, before you disappear, Monday's class, or Tuesday, sorry, next Tuesday's class is the final of the 12-hour new agent stuff. If you can be here in person, please do. If you can't, that's fine. But it'll be more fun because we're going to play a game. So the whole class on Tuesday is a game. We're going to play Jeopardy, and it's way more fun if you're here in person than if you're on Zoom. So if you can't, you can't. Like sometimes we have people from St. George. Obviously, I wouldn't expect you to drive up, but so if you have to do Zoom, do Zoom. But if you can, Allie, be here, then be here. I don't know who else is on Zoom. I just saw
bars.
What?
Will you bring candy bars?
Oh, maybe I will. Maybe there will be treats for
Maybe.
the
I'm
people in person.
I'm in.
Danielle, yeah, you can be here. Shannon, Randy might not want to, but if you can, come be here. It'll be more fun, I promise.
It's a lot of fun.
It'll be more fun.
You want to chat.
No, we gotta check. You know, let's see. Probably somebody telling me they can't.
Oh, no.
Oh, he's just putting his.
Oh.
Okay, cool. All right. Thanks for being here. We'll see you on Tuesday. We're gonna play that game and then that's it. So,
Thanks for us.
see you on Tuesday.
Good job.
Hey, buddy.
What'd you guys think?
Because
Um,
I was with a client just now, I was meeting with him.
Not sure.